Good afternoon, good morning. Welcome to our 200th Betting Online Sports Economics Seminar. Thank you to everyone who's helped make that happen. 5 years and lots of great talks along the way, lots of great contributors. Some like Rob, hybrid, some of the few hybrid presenters we've had in the series. And Dave, I think you are the presenter who's presented most. This is your 7th talk. It's great to have such keen participants, because obviously the series wouldn't happen if there weren't people willing to give talks and people coming along every Friday. So thank you, everyone. We are sponsored by the Sports Economics Review. It's always important to mention that support that we get and support from the University of Reading as well. Dave has the usual hour and a half to play around with when there's time for questions and comments along the way. Dave is going to present on what was Caitlin Clark worth, exploitation, reparations, and the economics of college basketball. All yours, Dave.
Well, thank you. I am so happy to do this again. I love doing this. This is my favorite little place to present, mostly because I get to stay in my house. Well, this is my house, my office. This is my office for another year, and that is my balcony. So I'm in my office. So it's fun. It's fun doing this. I'm glad you do this. This is great, and I'm glad that I get to be 200 there. So this is a talk that I gave. I actually went to an academic meeting for the first time in 6 or 7 years. It was in Vegas, which is 2 hours from my house. So that's why I went. And I presented this in Vegas. But in a conference, you only have like 20 minutes. And I had a lot to say about this. And so there's a lot of slides. And one of my co-authors said, "What the hell is all the slides? You're never going to get through all that." And I didn't get through all of it. I had to cut it short. So this is a better forum for that, so I can go through the whole story that I want to tell. And this is a work in progress. I'm not quite sure how to put this all together into a paper, but this is kind of what this is going to be. So let me share my screen with you. Let's see here. Let's see if I can get that to work. There it is. Okay. Share. Okay, well, that's weird. Where is the, oh, okay, forget it. I know where it is. Okay, let's do it this way. That'll work better. There it is. Okay. So can you see that?
Yep.
And that's the slideshow?
Perfect.
Perfect. All right, we're ready to go. All right, so this is what was Caitlin Clark worth, and then there's a subtitle that has a lot more words in it: exploitation, reparations, and the economics of college basketball. So that's a lot of stuff for one paper. My co-authors on this are Stacy Brook, who I think most of you know. Alex Chowdhury is one of my colleagues at SUU, and Courtney Paulson was a colleague of mine at SU. Alex and Courtney are stats professors. And as I mentioned in Vegas, and as I'll mention later on, stats professors kind of ruin stats for all of us. But they're part of this as well. This was a story that just came out in the New York Times that is not exactly what I'm doing, but kind of captures a sentiment about Caitlin Clark. So this came out in the New York Times. This was actually in the print edition of the New York Times yesterday, and it was at the Athletic website a few days ago. And I'm just putting the headline because I think the headline captures sort of a sentiment about Caitlin Clark. If Caitlin Clark's worth $1 billion, that's sort of the sentiment that I'm trying to talk about, because I think I'm going to make an argument that I don't think that we're thinking about her exactly the way we should be. But let me start why people think she's worth $1 billion to the WNBA, why they thought she was worth $1 billion in college. So this is a data point. In 2024, the women's NCAA championship game, which involved Caitlin Clark and South Carolina, Averaged 18.7 million viewers, peaked at 24 million. That was more than the men got for their championship. And so, it appears that, there's this big rating boost that comes along with Caitlin Clark. And so there's this story. Women's basketball has seen a rocket rise in popularity in recent years, and Iowa senior Caitlin Clark, now the NCAA's women all-time leading scorer, has provided a lot of fuel. Throughout the build-up to the historic feat, the all-time college basketball scoring record, Clark's generational talent brought more eyeballs to broadcast, fans to arenas, and all-around attention to the game. She led the country in scoring and assists. Clark has been described as a combination of Steph Curry and Pete Maravich, superstars from different eras of the men's game. She has inspired books. Howard Megdal wrote a book, Becoming Caitlin Clark. That book is not what you would think it is exactly. That's mostly a book about Iowa basketball. At least that's the way I took it when I read it. The Kristen Brennan book is just really kind of a little bit more odd. Kristen Brennan has become sort of almost Caitlin Clark's publicist. She has been a huge proponent of everything Caitlin Clark does, even though she's a USA Today writer. And so her book's a little bit closer to the idea that Caitlin Clark is this person who has transformed everything. These are the stats on Caitlin Clark. All-time leading scorer in college basketball history, whether you're looking at men or women. She led the NCAA women in scoring in every season she played. And that's going to be an important point I'm going to come back to. She was only second team All-American her first year in 2020-21, but then she was first team her last 3 years. She was awarded the Naismith Award, Best College Player, Wooden Award, Best College Player her last 2 seasons. She was given the Honda Cup Award, which is the best women athlete, not just basketball, but athlete her last 2 years. So she was a star from the very beginning when she got on the court at Iowa. Again, she led the college basketball in scoring her very first season. And then she finishes as this huge star. So there's this idea that she's like transforming everything. And I want to talk about that sentiment in the context of what happened historically in men's basketball. This isn't a comment from Walt Frazier, who starred in the NBA in the late 60s, early 70s. There's a wonderful documentary about the New York Knicks' last championship teams, which were in the early 1970s. Walt Frazier was the star of that team. And in the documentary, they point out that when Walt Frazier was starring with the Knicks, the NBA didn't get very much attention from the media. To illustrate that, when Walt Frazier signed a contract that called for him to be paid $300,000 per year, and that was $300,000 per year in 1973. So Walt Frazier, as I said in my last talk, was paid more money in 1973 than WNBA players are paid today. So, but that was the last paper, which, by the way, was accepted for publication yesterday. So that's coming out. So he was, but that was a big contract in 1973. If you go and look up in the New York Times that story of him signing that contract, you'll find an article that basically just says Walt Frazier signed a contract that'll pay him $300,000 a year, and then that's about all the story says. And you want to sort of think about, well, Walt Frazier is a major star of the Knicks. He just signed a contract that caused him to pay $300,000 a year, $1.5 million. This sounds like that's big news. And it wasn't. Nobody really paid much attention to the Knicks in the early. And he says this in this quote: "What's the big difference between time of your championship teams today and today?" He says, "It's the hoopla. You have games on every night, so they're on TV every night. When we played Los Angeles in the finals, the game from Los Angeles were on tape delay. We would be in overtime, and they would just cut the game off on television. They stigmatized players as being all black. Highly paid players were doing drugs. And only when other sports started to have drug problems, they had to back off the NBA. That gave us a better image." And then he says this: "Then Bird Magic came along, and the rest is history." And that's the story that people tell. And they told that same story about Caitlin Clark, that Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese are like Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. The WNBA commissioner said that their impact is the same as Larry Bird and Magic Johnson upon their arrival in '79. Bird and Johnson are often credited with rejuvenating the NBA. Okay, so that's a story that people say is that Magic and Larry changed the NBA. The problem with that story is it's not in the data. This is NBA average attendance in the 1970s. The story that people told is that in the late 1970s, the NBA was dying. And as Walt Frazier said, there were a lot of stories about Black athletes doing drugs. That was a big thing. And so, but if you look at the attendance data, you don't really see this. In 71, 72, when the NBA is about, at that point, about 25, 26 years old, it's in its third decade, just like the WNBA today. Average attendance is 8,000. WNBA attendance today is close to 10,000. It's not, it's not terribly different. And then what you see as you go through the 70s is a gradual increase. It tends to go up every year until you get to 77, 78, 78. Then you see a slight, very tiny dip in attendance. It kind of just stagnates for a couple of years. And you want to understand that in those couple of years, the dominant NBA teams were the Washington Bullets and the Seattle Supersonics. And they weren't really dominant. They were only winning like 50 games a year. The NBA had a lot. That was the peak of the NBA's competitive balance. They had this big influx of talent from the ABA. Every team had pretty good players for a very brief period of time before they expanded some more. And they were really competitive. And the dominant teams that won championships were in two markets that were not very big. And so the attendance kind of stagnated a little bit, just a little bit. But still, 10,800 is not bad. And then this is 79-80 is Larry Bird Magic show up, and attendance goes up 1.8%. And then the next year, it dropped 9%. This is the biggest drop in the 20th century for the NBA in 1 year. So it's like, well, that can't be. Well, if Bird and Magic are transforming the NBA, why did the attendance suddenly drop? And then when you go into the next decade, you see it starts to go back up again. But it goes up in spurts. So it goes up in 81, 82, then it drops back down again, then it goes back up, and then 84, 85, bigger than 85. And then you notice the percentages start getting a lot bigger. We go from 11,000 to almost 12,000 to 13,000, 15,000. Suddenly there's these big upticks in attendance. But by the time we get to the late 80s, when we see the big upticks in attendance, Bird's already been there for several years. Magic's been there for several years. Michael Jordan came along in 84. He'd already by the time we get to 15,000, he's already in his fourth year. So the story that people remember is that Bird, Magic, and Jordan are transforming the NBA. And you're like, well, that doesn't seem quite right because it doesn't seem to coincide when they showed up. Something else was going on at the same time, and that is television. In the early 80s, after Bird and Magic arrived, it was still the case that the NBA Finals were on tape delay. Why were they on tape delay? It wasn't necessarily because the NBA was totally unpopular. It was because the NBA was scheduling their finals during the sweep weeks of the network. So at that point in time, the networks, there's three major networks, ABC, NBC, CBS. They would have a week in the spring, in June or so. And during that week is when they would put their best programming on, and they would try to get as many advertising eyeballs, and those weeks would set sort of their advertising rates. The NBA wanted to put their finals right in that week. And the network, CBS, was like, well, I'm not going to broadcast the NBA finals during sweeps weeks. That would be insane. You're not my best. It's not like you're bad programming, but you're just not my best programming. And so that's why they put it on tape delay. When David Stern took over in 1983, he was like, well, why don't we just put the finals in a different week? How hard would that be? Which tells you the level of thinking in the NBA that it took them several years to figure out that you could just move the schedule a week. So there you go. That's the NBA. And so when they did the finals, CBS started to put more games on. But then the big thing I think that happened is TBS and TNT come along. TBS was putting on games on Tuesday and Friday night. I remember that growing up. Suddenly you could see the NBA on a regular basis. When I was very young, growing up in Detroit, my favorite player was Isaiah Thomas. I only saw Isaiah Thomas in the All-Star game. They didn't have Pistons games on national television. But when they got on TBS, well, then you could see your teams more often. And I just thought I'd put this sort of in economic terms. You put games on television, the price to view the games is essentially reduced for the viewer to zero. You don't have to spend money and you don't have to travel. So this dramatic reduction in price causes consumer interest and consumer demand to increase dramatically. Not surprisingly, when that happens, people then suddenly go, hey, you know what? I've seen this on television. Now I want to go to it. And so that, I think, is a better explanation of what's going on with the attendance, not Bird and Magic showed up. And I think the story of Caitlin Clark is not totally different from that. So here's the story of what happened in basketball in the last 5 years. So this begins with what is called the NCAA weight room gap, at least what I've called it. So in March of 2021, this is from a USA Today story, Sedona Prince, who was at the time playing for Oregon. She went on to play for other teams in college, but she was playing at Oregon. She posts a TikTok video and she spotlights the very big difference in the men's weight room and the women's weight room at the NCAA tournaments that were being held in a bubble. So that during COVID, they all put them in one spot. And the men are in one spot with 64 teams, and they get this big, I don't know if you can see the picture there, but they get this big giant weight room with lots of weights in it for all the teams. And then the women's weight room was this little tiny little right here, just this little tiny, it's one rack of dumbbells. That's for all 64 teams. Sedona Prince shows that and says, if you're not upset about this problem, then you're part of it. The video went viral overnight, forcing the NCAA to, okay, first of all, the NCAA's reaction to that was initially they floated this idea. They said, hey, we're going to give them a weight room, but we didn't have the budget to do it for all 64 teams, so we're going to do it after they get to the Sweet 16 or something like that. They floated that the first night. That didn't fly. So like within a day, they built this weight room with the pink, with pink lights, because they're women, so they like pink. Not a lot of weights in the room, but it's bigger. And so they did change it. And that sparked the NCAA to hire a law firm, Kaplan, Hecker, and Fink, who went and looked at the NCAA. And they argue that the NCAA has been systematically discriminating against the women, that there's all sorts of ways in which they do that. And then this led to the great statement by Mark Emmert, where he says, when you lay the men and women's championship side by side, it is pretty self-evident that we dropped the ball. So that makes it sound like this was all just sort of an accident. Soon after that, we see changes in the coverage of and promotion of women's college basketball. So in 2022, for the very first time, the NCAA Division Women's Basketball Championship was allowed to use the word March Madness when they were marketing their championship. That had never been allowed before. That was strictly for the men. That label, March Madness, was just for the men. They were using it for the women. Women's college basketball suddenly got more television coverage soon after that as well. And so suddenly they started to broadcast the entire tournament was suddenly found on television. And then starting in 2021, they also they started to broadcast more and more of women's college basketball during the regular season. And so that all changed after March 2021. The next season, 2021-2022, suddenly there is now a bigger television schedule for women's college basketball. What's interesting about that big increase in broadcasting is who they started to focus on. Now, again, going back to what I said earlier, Caitlin Clark is already leading scorer in the NCAA at this point. Okay, she's already the leading scorer in the NCAA. So she's already known. When they changed the schedule for 21-22, Caitlin Clark is already a known commodity. She already exists. She already is the leading scorer in college basketball. So when they announce the schedule for 21-22, you would think, well, Caitlin Clark is the star, right? Right? No, she wasn't. First regular season game ever on network television for women's college basketball. It's the first time a regular season game was ever on network television. December 11, 2021. The game they scheduled, they picked UCLA versus University of Connecticut. They had 19 games scheduled for ESPN in 2021-22. Only one of them involved Caitlin Clark. There were 23 games scheduled for ESPN2 in that season. Only 2 involved Caitlin Clark. The stars they focused on were Paige Bueckers. Paige Buecker was the star. She was the one. The reason why they picked UCLA Connecticut is because Paige Buecker is first team All-American, Naismith Award winner in 2021. She's the star. She's the one they think is going to be the star. And so that's the game they choose as the very first regular season women's college basketball game on network television. Paige Bueckers is the one they choose. And they also, when you look at where they scheduled for the ESPN2 games, Aaliyah Boston is scheduled for a lot of games. Cameron Brink of Stanford is picked for a lot of games. These are the players who people think are going to be the stars, not some player from the University of Iowa. So to me, the story is the television changed first. And then Caitlin Clark comes along. It's not Caitlin Clark comes along and then the television changes. I don't think the story fits that. I'm going to show you something else with the revenue data. So this is Stacy Brooks' big thing. There's 2 sources of college revenue data. I've written papers with Equity and Athletics data, which is freely available online, very easy to get to, a very nice website to play with. It reports data for revenue and expense data for every college team. It's great. And then Stacy Brooks was like, yeah, but it's all fictitious. There's nobody, it's entirely self-reported. I've written papers with this and I kind of knew it was self-reported. I knew that. I did once look at the data for my school with the athletic director of SUU in my office, and she was looking at it. And I showed her what they said the revenue and expense data for SU was for different sports. And she's like, I don't know what the hell that data means. I've never seen any numbers like that. So it's self-reported. It's not very accurate. So Stacy Brooks has said, look, you can't really use that data. You should probably be using the MFRS, the Membership Financial Reporting System data, which you can get from the Chronicle of Higher Education as well as from making public record. Stacy does this. He makes public record request data. And so he goes and captures all this data. And so he uses that. He says, this is all data that's been audited. It's what they report. So it's their data, not what some intern might have reported into a system for the government. And so if you look at that data, this is what you see for the women's college basketball revenue from you can only get the data for by the way, MFRS data is only public schools. You can't get private schools because private schools don't have to give you this. But the public schools do. And most of the schools in the Power 5 are public schools. So if you look at the Power 5 schools, what you see is the average revenue in real terms in 2013 is at 1.5 million. It really doesn't change very much. It goes up and down a little bit. There's COVID. Still at 1.5 million in 2023. Then the last 2024 suddenly jumps up 28%, right? And so you say, oh, Caitlin Clark. That's Caitlin Clark. Well, okay, maybe. So if you look at the men's, you certainly don't see, this is the men's data, you don't see any actual evidence of any real substantial change. It was about 16.6 million in real terms in 2013 and about 17 million in 2024. That's because most of the men's revenue is coming from the television deal, and that really hasn't changed much. That didn't change a lot. That will change dramatically in a few years because it's going to go up a lot. But the television deal is what's driving a lot of this. And that hasn't changed much during this time period. So that's why the data kind of is stable. But there's no Caitlin Clark effect, right? Okay. All right. So in 2023, the average public Power 5 men's team is at 17.3 million. The average women's is at about 2 million. Women saw a substantial increase from 2023 to 2024. The men didn't see the same increase. So something's going on in the women's game. It's not going on in the men's game. So something had to have happened at the time. Now, if you break it down by school, you see this from 2023 to 2024. The biggest uptick of any team in dollars is Connecticut. They went from 4.4 million to 8 million. That's what they report as their revenue change. Iowa is the second biggest. That's Caitlin Clark, obviously. In percentage terms, NC State's the biggest. They go up 230%. But a lot of schools go up, Caitlin, Iowa's not the only team seeing a large increase in revenue from 23 to 24. And it's not that Caitlin Clark went and visited Connecticut a lot of times, and that's what causes the uptick. I mean, this is not Caitlin Clark. Caitlin Clark, that's not what's causing this. It's you're seeing a revenue increase for a lot of different teams. So I think the story about the Caitlin Clark economy may not be quite right. It seems to me that the sequence is Sedona Prince's video sparks changes in women's college basketball. One of these changes is a change in television coverage. And then just like we saw in the 80s, the change in coverage changes what's going on. And the revenue changes occur across all sports. So that took me 25 minutes to explain that, but that's sort of the background to what I'm talking about. So there's a finance professor out there in the New York Times article saying Caitlin Clark is worth hundreds of millions of billions of dollars. And I think that is the argument that people are making is A came before B, therefore A caused B. And I'm like, I think there's other things going on at the same time that you're not taking into account. And I'm not talking about the WNBA here, but you would say the same thing about the WNBA, and that the coverage of the WNBA has also changed in the last year or so. And so you change the way you cover something, it does change the level of interest in something. So with that in mind, I'm going to go through and say, well, this is how I think we should think about the value of Caitlin Clark, and we're going to just do the standard approach that I've done in a number of articles. So Gerald Scully argued, he has the Gerald Scully model, which I have noted that I don't think is very good. When I presented the WNBA gender wage gap, which used the approach that I'm going to be using here, and the comment from the referees was I went through and I explained in detail several times how to do the approach, what I call the Berri Goff approach, which I don't know that Brian Goff wants me calling it now, but I do. Which I explained with Tony Krautman, but it actually goes back further than that. And one of the comments from the referees from that paper that I did last February at Rose's, when I submitted it, they said, you don't have to explain it every single time you do it. That's getting tedious. I am going to explain it in this talk one time, but maybe people are it's not that complicated of an approach anyways. All right. So the Berri Goff approach, I just keep adding, all the times this is being used in literature. A lot of it's me, but there are other people do it too. Other people have used this approach. It does go back to Brian Goff did 2014, did an article in Forbes. I did an article in The Atlantic. You'll notice they're about 10 days apart. I did discover, and I had forgotten I had done this, that Dan Rasher and I presented a paper at the Westerns in 2013 using this approach about college basketball. I had not remembered I had done that, but it is true we had done that. And we never published it. I don't know whatever happened to that. So it goes back to 2013. But Brian did it independently in Forbes. And so there you go. All right. So this is the basic steps, how you measure economic value, is you start off and you say, okay, how much revenue should go to the players? And that's the part about this that is somewhat arbitrary, because Gerald Scully, what he did is he ran a regression and said, I'll just let the regression tell me. And what Tony and I pointed out in that paper in 2019 is that, the value you get from the regression varies tremendously across time. And sometimes you'll find that what you get is players are worth more revenue than the revenue that actually existed, which is actually what Gerald Scully found in 1974. He didn't say it. I think he knew it, but he didn't say it. But his model did say players are worth more money than the leagues actually have. And then if you do it for the NFL, you find that, revenue and wins, I've published research where revenue and wins in the NFL aren't even related. So the regression approach is not, it may make you feel like you're being objective, but it's just not telling you anything very accurate. And so I think at the end of the day, you just have to say, generally in North American sports, they give 50% of the revenue to the players. Let's just start with that. What is that? Where does that take us? And so the University of Iowa women's basketball team reported $6.5 million in revenue in 23-24. 50% go to the players, and $3.2 million goes is what the players are splitting. You got to figure out the average wage and the minimum wage. So one of the things I don't like about the original Scully approach as well is because he doesn't take into account the fact that there are players who don't produce any wins because they don't really play. They do have value. You have to have practice. You have to have somebody who's there in case injuries happen. And the leagues recognize the value of those players. They do pay them something, typically a minimum wage. In the NBA, that minimum wage is 10% of the average. So if the 13 players who played for Iowa in 20 split 3.2 million, the average wage would be 249,000, which means the 10%, the minimum is 24,000. So every player is given almost around $25,000. To calculate the value win, we begin by arguing that all players are guaranteed that 24,941. So 13 players get the minimum wage. So you subtract that off from the money you're allocating to players. That leaves $2.9 million to allocate according to each player's production of wins. So we're still saying they're being paid for producing wins, which you can measure how many wins they produce. So each win is worth $85,000. And effectively, that would be the same as the coefficient you would get from running a regression is 85,671. What is Caitlin Clark worth? Now that becomes fairly easy. She produced 10.9 wins, so she is really, really good. She is not Pete Maravich. Pete Maravich was not really all that good. People have pointed out Pete Maravich would have scored more points if he had a 3-point shot than Caitlin Clark. Well, that's true, but Pete Maravich also scored a lot of points because he took a lot more shots than Caitlin Clark, and a lot of those didn't go in. He was not that great of a shooter. And so Caitlin Clark is actually a really good shooter and a rebounder and gets a lot of assists, so she's worth a lot of wins. And so her value would be $24,940, which is the minimum wage, plus the value of a win times how many wins, nearly $1 million. Okay, so she's worth nearly $1 million. And you can do this for every year that she played. And so you can see her margin revenue product goes up as the team revenue goes up pretty dramatically across her years. And so there you go. So she produced in real terms almost $2 million for Iowa. You see a big leap her last year, even though her win production declined a little bit. And this seems to be primarily due to changes in attendance. Now, what about the television numbers? Now, this is the other part I want to emphasize today is the television numbers. Okay. So in 2010, CBS Turner Broadcasting signed a 14-year contract with the NCAA that pays them $10.8 billion. Which is why that NCAA men's basketball data, that revenue data doesn't change any because they signed the deal in 2010 and it doesn't change. That's what they got, and that's most of their revenue. And then they did extend the deal in 2016, and the extension kicks in, if I remember right, next year is when they start getting the 1.1 billion. But then it goes up. So there's going to be an uptick in revenue going forward for the men. Just to emphasize, the men are getting going forward $1 billion per year for their television rights. They get $1 billion per year. And again, as I started off at the very beginning, I said the women got higher ratings in 24 than the men got. But the men get $1.1 billion for their rights. Now, this is what's interesting on the women's side. In 2010, the NCAA and Disney, which is Disney's the parent company for ABC and ESPN, they agreed on a deal that gave the NCAA $34 million, that's it, for the broadcast rights, 29 championships. The championships included all of women's sports and most of men's sports besides football and basketball. That worked out to about $1.2 million per sport. Okay. Then after the Sedona Prince video comes out and the lawyers say the NCAA dropped, then Mark Emmert says we dropped the ball. You didn't. And in that report, the lawyers said, the women's college basketball rights all by themselves, we would estimate are worth at least $80 million, if not $112 million. Okay, so that's what they said. So they argued in that report, 81 to 112 million, and that was before 2024. So this report was done before Caitlin Clark and the ESPN, the television deal. So it'd probably be worth more if you included what happened after that. But nevertheless, they said it was worth quite a bit more. So January of 2024, that's 3 months before the ratings that we saw in the March Madness of 2024, ESPN and the NCAA they negotiated a new deal that pays the NCAA $920 million across 8 years for the broadcast right to 40 different college sports. That's almost everything besides football and men's college basketball. That includes all of women's sports. Then they said this. Okay, then they said this. They said that in the deal, women's college basketball is going to be valued at $65 million. That's not what the lawyer said, but it's more than what they were doing before. Okay, now here's what's odd about those numbers. So women's college basketball gets $65 million. 920 divided by 8 is $115 million. So it's $115 million per year for 40 different sports, but you're going to give $65 million of that is just for women's college basketball. So if you do the math on that, that means that they're going to give $50 million for 39 sports. That's just $1.3 million per sport. Okay, go back a little back to what we said before. It was $1.2 million per sport. Now it's $1.3 million per sport. In real terms, that's actually less. We've had some inflation. So the NCAA is effectively saying from 2011 to 2032, when the second deal expires, the broadcasting rights for women's volleyball, gymnastics, softball, soccer is actually going down. That's what they claim. It's going down. Well, I didn't write. It's not going down. We've had huge ratings in volleyball and gymnastics and soccer and softball. Didn't go. Nebraska volleyball got 90,000 people to show up for a match. I mean, it's so this is not quite right. And then we have this story, and this came out in the last year or so about the WNBA. Is that this is the Mark Shapiro story? So the 2024 WNBA finals between the Lynx and the Liberty. What the news report said is it had the highest television ratings in 25 years for the WNBA. But the WNBA is older than 25 years. So how could it be that the WNBA had higher ratings 25 years ago? Well, it turns out when the WNBA first started, they were on NBC in their first 3 seasons, and they averaged 1.5 million viewers per game on NBC back in the late 90s. But then ESPN ABC bought the rights to the WNBA, and Mark Shapiro was in charge of programming ESPN. And he said in an interview, he says, I told the commissioner, David Stern, the NBA, by the way, owns the WNBA. The WNBA stinks. It doesn't rate. I don't want it. No one watches it. Men don't watch it. Women don't watch it. My goal is to get it off the air. He said that. Now, but people did watch it. There was a lot of people watching it. But Mark Shapiro didn't watch it, and he was the decision maker. So he buries this on ESPN2. He makes it so you can't find it, and suddenly the television ratings go to hell. Okay. By the way, neat, fun little fact. The NCAA deal that they just negotiated, the $920 million deal, what was the consulting company that advised the NCAA on that deal? It was Mark Shapiro's company that advised the NCAA. So Mark Shapiro appears to be a menace. All right. So I think this is something I want to talk about in terms of value of athletes. So I went through and I said value of Caitlin Clark, 900,000. But there's a problem with that. There's been a long history of discrimination in women's sports, so it's held back the audience. And then you have men who are negotiating very bad deals for the women. And so when we think about the ratings that women's college basketball gets, it doesn't feel like the schools are collecting the money that they should be from those ratings, which means revenue is being created, but it's being kept by ESPN. It's not being given to the schools and the NCAA. So when we evaluate the value of Caitlin Clark, we would underestimate her tremendously because a lot of the revenue that she was generating in those ratings, that all went to ESPN. ESPN got that money. Or the advertisers got the money because they'd have to pay very high fees to advertise in those games. And so they got a deal. They got a lot more eyeballs than they paid for. Somebody was getting the revenue besides the teams and besides the athletes. And that means when we try to figure out the value of Caitlin Clark, it becomes kind of difficult, right? Because that revenue isn't being given to the teams. And so that leads us to the reparations argument, which Stefan Szymanski's made and we made in Slaying the Trolls. The revenue advantages men have over women are not entirely earned. These advantages reflect decades of discrimination and poorly negotiated deals. What if this didn't happen and women's college basketball matched what we see in men's college basketball? What would be the value then? Well, if you do that, the value of Caitlin Clark with average men's revenue, if you just do the average men's revenue across these years, her same production, but we're using the men's revenue data. What if we say, hey, women's revenue would be the same as men if we didn't have all these problems? Then suddenly she's worth 13.3 million, not 1.9 million. Very different story. Okay. So that leads me to my last point, talking about Caitlin Clark, is that, again, I'm arguing that Caitlin Clark is not magical. She benefited a lot from a change in television coverage that did not go to other players. I would point out we could tell this exact same story about A'ja Wilson. A'ja Wilson was, this is the A'ja Wilson statue on the South Carolina campus. And she's, won, unlike Caitlin Clark, she won championships when she was in college. She's also won multiple WNBA titles, been multiple times WNBA MVP. But she's not Caitlin Clark because when she played college basketball, they didn't have the same television coverage. You didn't get to see A'ja Wilson all the time. Same thing would be true for Brianna Wilson. Brianna Stewart won 4 NCAA championships in a row. She was the dominant player in college basketball for 4 consecutive years. But again, she doesn't end up being the star that Caitlin Clark is because they didn't have the coverage at that time. Sabrina Ionescu is the first player in NCAA history, man or woman, to record 2,000 career points, 1,000 career assists, and 1,000 career rebounds. She is also the all-time leader, whether you think of men or women, with 26 triple-doubles. So she is another one who, why wasn't it Sabrina Ionescu being the major star? Again, the television coverage wasn't there. Aaliyah Boston. Now this gets at another point we'd make about why is it Caitlin Clark and not Aaliyah Boston? Aaliyah Boston was a star at roughly the same time period, although she came out 1 year earlier. But of course, she's African-American and not. So it does seem like the television focuses a lot on the white player. That's another separate issue entirely that we could focus on. I would point out, if you go through the MRP data and you look at the value of the win for different teams from 2012, 2013 in real terms, players who produced $4 million in a single season. Caitlin Clark is one, did it a couple of times in real terms, but a number of other players would have been worth $4 million when you look at the revenue and you adjust for inflation. So she's not the only player who was tremendously productive, who was incredibly valuable. A lot of other players were valuable. They didn't become quite as famous. So if we use the actual revenue numbers, we have to understand that the television numbers are depressed. It appears a lot of the revenue is captured by ESPN or their advertisers. There's also this long history of discrimination. So if we think about what is the value of Caitlin Clark, I think we have to, in the end, think about the history of women's sports. We can't just look at the revenue numbers and take those as that's definitely what's going on. I would add also, I don't think we should be going A came before B, therefore A caused B. I don't think that's entirely right. I think we have to think a little bit harder about what was going on, what other factors were going on at the same time. And so I concluded my talk in Vegas by saying, what's the value of Caitlin Clark? And my answer was, I don't know. I don't know. What do you all think? So I think that's my answer. I think that's kind of a lot of the papers I've written lately has been saying, I think we want to think that we can look at the data and go, there's that number and that's the value and I know it. And I think when you think about it, you're like, well, I don't know, a lot of things you could think about. And you come up with different numbers depending on how you think about it. So the answer is, and I think this is, to me, what is the classic answer in economics. The answer is, well, it depends on how you look at it. which is what I tell students all the time. And the fact that I often tell students that the answer is it depends on how you look at it. My wife, who studied biology during the pandemic, and she heard me lecture and she heard me say that. Her response to that argument is, "This is why economics is totally bullshit. Nobody should believe anything you say because all your answers are it just depends on how you look at it. What the hell's that? I could do that." And I'm like, well, that's kind of what we do. And that's my talk. So I'm glad I got through all the slides, but it did take longer than 15 minutes. So hopefully that was enjoyable.
Thank you, Dave. Enjoyable as always. I will send you a quick Teams round of applause, and we have plenty of time for questions and comments from the audience. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. Steve, you put your camera on with intent. Do you want to ask a question? Go ahead.
I tried to put up my hand, but I'm technically deficient there. So as Dave knows, I've known him by the way, happy 4th of July to all of our British friends. I was just reading a great piece about how Lord North was such an abuser of British liberty. And if he had not lost the War of Independence, Britain might have lost all their liberties. And it was the American loss that forced him out of office that saved British liberty. So that's a nice revisionist piece there.
Wow. That is revisionist. that could lead to a whole nother discussion. That's really great. I was going to point out the entire American Revolution was a war fought between the British and the French, and the Americans were just kind of bystanders.
But Dave, really interesting piece. I learned long ago in my close work with Stefan Szymański that one of my great frustrations with economists is that they are not willing to wake up each day and ask, how can I use my professional talents to answer questions Steve Ross wants to ask and to pursue his research agenda? So I accept that applies to you as well. And this certainly is consistent with your general approach as a economic contrarian. To me, there's a really interesting piece of this story that I would, a couple of things that I would suggest to you. The short one is, if you're just being contrarian or commenting on people who just spout facts, opinions, and you want to look at it, I do think the whole black-white issue is something worth looking at. Both the perception that the only reason there's a widespread perception in some places that the only reason people are paying attention to the WNBA is because they have a white straight star, as opposed to the many players there who are Black or LGBT. And I think that would be actually worth applying your skills to. The broader question to me, as somebody who comes from antitrust law and originally engaged with industrial organization economists, is the story about how the NCAA undervalues its assets. And a key part of IO economics is everybody who's economically rational tries to maximize their revenues. And why wouldn't they do that? And why isn't there enough competition in the market to lead to that result? And to me, that this idea, this narrative, which I accept as factually true, and which may involve doing interdisciplinary work with somebody in organizational behavior, but to me, this narrative that the NCAA is trying to make all this money to support all its causes and has every incentive to be a revenue maximizer. And the idea that they have undervalued their assets because some good old boy tells some other good old boy that an asset is not worth very much is a story that I think needs to be explored, because I think it has really important implications, not only for sport and sports governance, but IO generally, because the basic IO model that underlies antitrust law is that people are behaving rationally, and profit maximizers are going to try to maximize profits, and revenue maximizers are going to try to maximize revenues. And if people aren't doing that because some good old boy tells some other good old boy some incorrect story, not based on evidence that's relatively easily disprovable, I mean, I think that raises fundamental questions about competition policy and IO economics. So I would just encourage you to think about the answer to the story. How does that happen as a matter of organizational behavior that such a valuable commercial asset would be persistently undersold in the market? And one other quick comment on that. There's a huge literature, as you may well know, about employment discrimination, whether it's efficient and things like that, with the leading critics pointing out that when discrimination is so socially pervasive, as it was in the southern United States and may still be in many places, marketplace economics won't correct for it. But I don't think that tells the story, at least in the last 10 years in women's sport, that it's so pervasive that nobody really wants to watch women's sport, or no one actually thinks they were undervalued. So anyway, I'd encourage you to think about that aspect of the story, building on the Shapiro story you related.
Well, I've spent 30 years or so writing about sports, and my comment on the idea that people are rational, and I've written extensively about this, is that's all bullshit. They're not rational. I've actually met people. What the hell do I mean? Have you met a person? So they're not. Economists made up that story, and it's because economists don't go talk to people. They're not. That's not how they make this. I totally can believe that Mark Shapiro sat in a room as the decision maker and said, I don't like women's basketball. I ain't going to show it. That is exactly how he did it. I totally believe that. And the idea that he said, hey, Mark, you're leaving money on the table. I don't give a shit. I have a job. I make a lot of money, and I don't like this. And that's it. And the idea that people are maximizing on the margin and they're trying to maximize all their profits, that's not how people behave. So that's just not actually accurate. And I've published lots of research showing that there is persistent irrationality in all sorts of different sports settings. So that is true.
Right. But just one final comment here and let others engage. To me, the important economic IO issue, so I'll try to play in the pool of some people here, is not, are people rational? It is, why isn't there a marketplace correction for it? And there are many of us in academia who have been undervalued by irrationality at the institution we are, and often the people move somewhere else. There are conferences where irrationally people don't produce sort of stuff that other people would like to hear. And we have Roses, we have the UMBC conference, we have all sorts of market responses to the fact that other people might undervalue sports economics and the value of sports economists going together. So there's something there. So to me, the point isn't why would Mark Shapiro hold that view and why would Emmert agree with his buddy Mark Shapiro. The question is, given that irrationality, why did they get away with it? And if you want to talk about a social psychology of irrationality, okay, that's an interesting story, but that goes beyond the comment you just made that people have feelings and are irrational. And so to me, the interesting question is, why isn't the market correcting for these sorts of pathologies that you're observing?
Well, Steve, the NCAA is a cartel. I mean, they're the ones who do this. They own the market, and ESPN and ABC have tremendous market power. So it is the case that if Mark Shapiro at ESPN makes a decision, well, then that pretty much damn holds. What were your choices? And so, when it comes to shopping these things, now on the men's side, they do make a higher effort to shop this stuff around. But it is the case. When you go back and you look at the story of how that NCAA how the women's sports rights were sold, and you read through the actual story, one of the things they'll tell you in the story is, well, when ESPN announced the deal, they said, okay, this deal went pretty fast. And they're like, why did it go so fast? Well, NCAA never called anybody else. Why did they only get $900 million? They didn't call anybody. They didn't go call any other entity and say, what would you give us for this? But they had Mark Shapiro, the consulting firm, go, you know what? I think that's all you're going to get. Well, how does Mark Shapiro know that? Well, I'm a consultant, so I know. And you're like, okay, the market explanation for that is that, well, there isn't actually very much competition. So I think that's pretty clear that that's what's going on here.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Time for lots of other questions. Anyone else with questions and comments? Rob. Can't hear you, Rob. Can't see you either.
We can't hear you. We got your hand up. Rob got his hand up, though.
I'm here. Yeah, great talk, Dave. Can I ask about TV ratings? Have those gone up for women's basketball? What's the trajectory there?
Well, they were at 18 million for the 2024. 2025 was lower. They went down. They were still 2025 was higher than anything before 2024 for the finals, but it was not as high as 2024. And we have seen the ratings, the general trend being going up beyond just what Caitlin Clark does. And so it's not just a Caitlin Clark effect. You do see this across board. In that New York Times article, I would point out one of the people and I was quoted in the article, but not they didn't include what I told them. They just included one quote, but I told them, but they didn't include my, hey, it's complicated. But there was somebody else saying Caitlin Clark has raised the women's sports everywhere. I don't know if people in Europe knew that Caitlin Clark is responsible for women's sports everywhere in the known universe and the multiverse. But that was pretty much what they said. And it's like, no, that's not even true in basketball. We do see higher ratings in women's basketball, both at the professional level and the college level, even when you don't have Caitlin Clark anywhere in the building. And so it's not just Caitlin Clark, but to answer your question, there has been higher ratings. That has actually happened.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Other questions and comments?
I stunned him into silence.
I have one very short question for you, trivial question for you, Dave, which is on one of the slides of stats, you talked about something called the double triple, and I've got no idea what that is. So I thought maybe you could tell me what a double triple is.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's okay. So a triple double in basketball is if you get double figures in points, rebounds, and assists, then it's a triple double. You can also get triple doubles in other stats. So if you had 10 steals, they would count that. That'd be an unusual triple double. But it's double figures in 3 positive stats. Sometimes they get double figures in turnovers, but that's not considered a positive thing to do. And Sabrina Ionescu did a lot of triple doubles when she was a player. Which the idea is that typically people are good at scoring, but not at other things, or they're good at other things and not scoring. So triple double is a way of thinking about a player who does a lot of things really well. So that's kind of why it's a stat that people are interested in. So
makes sense. Yeah. Any more questions and comments from the audience?
Everyone went off to celebrate July 4th.
So I think of those left, only Steve is on your side of the ocean. So, Jess.
Yeah.
Not an American. Go ahead, Jess.
No, I'm not an American, but I'm supporting American sports today. They need all the support they can get. I've got a couple of questions. The first one would be, do you think having the sort of the face of the WNBA, if that is Caitlin Clark, do you think that's a useful thing? So this may be this fallacy that there is a figurehead or something. Does that actually drive spectator interest in a positive way, or is it negative?
I don't know. every sports league will have a face that they're pushing at any given time. One thing that this is something that I've observed in years of studying sports. I think everyone who's studied sports for a long time has picked up on this. There is always a star of the moment. Every league has because somebody wins the game, somebody wins the championship, somebody leads whatever it is you're leading in. And so they're the star of the moment. So they sort of become the face of the league. And then when those players aren't there, you'll have media people say, well, how will the league survive now that this player is not there? And you're like, yeah, they're going to keep playing games and somebody will win those games. And then that one will be the star. So somebody has to be the star. Caitlin Clark has become the star because she was the leading scorer in college. And I think the WNBA has, they have this odd basketball schedule and they play in the summer. The basketball leagues tend to play in the fall. And so that turned out to be an advantage because Caitlin Clark left that women's college championship, went to the WNBA draft a week later, went to the WNBA, started playing 2 weeks after that. So she was in the news constantly. She never changed. And that led her to become the face then because she was the one in the news. And it turned out she played really well her rookie year. And so that helped as well. So she became, what they marketed around. I think going forward, we're going to find that other people will start being marketed as well. Nafisa Collier, for instance, when they did the All-Star voting, finished 100,000 votes shy of Caitlin Clark. So she's now become a huge star because she created her own league. And I did ask Cheryl Reeve about that. How do you coach somebody who owns their own sports league? How exactly does that work? What's that conversation? Nafisa, I want you to do this. Cheryl, I own my own league. And in my league, we do it this way. Because I'm an owner of a league. There's that sort of dynamic that goes on. I think I agree with Steve on his point he was making that it is an issue. And I don't think it is at all surprising that it is a straight white woman that they focused on.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's at all surprising. And I think there are negative issues with that. It is a majority Black league. There are a lot of members of the league that are part of that are not heterosexual, and so they don't tend to promote that as much as they should. I will also point this out. I think we have to understand when we think about the WNBA, it is over 60% owned by the NBA. The NBA is the one that makes the decision. So it is a bunch of mostly white rich dudes in the background who are making decisions about what goes on. And the WNBA can do stuff and say things, but if those rich white guys in the background go, I don't like that, it does get shut down. They're not going to let things happen that they don't like. And they're the ones who control that, which is going to lead to a lot of problems when it comes to labor negotiations, because the NBA is not a very nice negotiator.
Yeah, my other question was about shoe deals, because they're a big part of their money-making potential, and they have more autonomy in that. So you're not just leaving it to the league to, negotiate your TV deals. So do you see this vast under sort of selling of women when they're getting shoe deals with Nike or whatever?
Well, I do know there was a story just a couple of years ago that first major shoe deals, WNBA, were all going to the white women. They did, because of social pressure, change that. And now Asia Wilson is one of the major shoe ones. And she's got a very, very prominent ad out now. Nafisa Collier has a pretty prominent ad out right now for the WNBA where they're featuring her in ads. So they're trying to change that as people bring attention to it. But initially it was the case that they were focusing strictly on the white players. Paige Buchers has come out and actually said that many, many times that, you people focus on me because I'm white, and there's something wrong with that. And you have to think about everybody else in the league as well. I don't think it's incorrect to say Caitlin Clark has attracted a certain element. that was not part of, that was not part of the WNBA fan base before. So she's seen as this white savior. And it's when you push back against that on social media, you find out those are not really nice people. So there's a lot of bad actors out there who are suddenly, and I think one of the things that's happened with this whole explosion in coverage and stuff is the story that I was trying to tell here is that you change the coverage, you change the outcome, and that would lead you to ask the question, well, then why didn't you just change the coverage earlier? You could have had this outcome earlier. And that makes people uncomfortable because that says, well, there's discrimination going on. So the narrative that the people who do discrimination would like to go is like, well, see, that didn't happen that way. What happened is this savior white woman showed up named Caitlin Clark, and she changed it all. And so there was never any discrimination. It was just we were waiting for the savior to come and save us. And yes, it was a white person, and that person saved us. And you're like, oh. And when you push back on that and go, I don't think that's what actually happened. Oh, you're just not seeing this. You have to see that it and so they get really angry about. And that's why you see also in the coverage of the WNBA, if Caitlin Clark someone follows her hard, a lot of people get mad. How can you touch her? No one should touch her. She should be in a glass box so that nobody ever touches her, because she is the only thing that keeps this league afloat. She saved it. And you're like, okay, that's not true. It's not in the data. No one's saving anything. But but they have to cling to that story, because the alternative story would be like, well, you didn't do the coverage. You discriminated against. Oh, I don't like that story at all. I hate that story. That would mean I'm a bad person. So people have narratives.
Well, yep, thank you.
Sure.
Great. Thanks, Jess. Any more questions and comments? Okay, well, thank you very much, Dave. Another very interesting talk. And that concludes our 200th Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. We'll be back for 201 next week. Bobby Butler from University College Cork, presenting objective calls under the spotlight of referee consistency and behaviour on football's biggest stage. So I wish you a happy rest of your 4th of July. Dave, thank you for getting up so early to present. A privilege for the rest of us. And we'll see you again soon.
All right. Bye, everybody. That was great.
Cheers. Bye-bye.